Hi, this is Regina Blackstock, and I'm going to share some information that proves the existence of 42 Creek Indian towns in North Florida. These towns existed in the early 1800s, and this video explains how they became lost to history. First, let's set the stage for our story with a little bit of background on Florida. Florida's history is unique. No other state shares the same timeline as Florida. Florida was a Spanish colony for 250 years, a British colony for 20 years, a Spanish territory again a second time for 35 years, and then it became a United States territory which lasted for 23 years before it reached statehood in 1845. Information on Indians living in Florida can be found in the records of Spain, Britain, and the United States. Each country produced a different collection of records. Those created by Spain, while the most comprehensive, are written in Spanish. Britain's records span a much shorter time period, only 20 years. The United States records don't begin until 1819. Florida was also the home of a large trading company named Panton Leslie and Company. It operated during the late 1700s and early 1800s. This company traded extensively with the southeastern Indians. It operated from its headquarters in Pensacola and St. Augustine and had a branch post at St. Mark's. In 1804, the company was renamed John Forbes and Company. It ceased operations around 1830. At one time, it claimed 1.4 million acres in North Florida near the Wakulla River. The land was traded by the Creek Indian Confederacy to cover their debts. Almost 100 years later, during the 1930s, researchers began compiling surviving records created by this company into a single collection. The project was completed in 1986 and produced 26 reels of microfilm and an index. The collection provided researchers with a wealth of new data on this area. Each country interacted differently with the southeastern Indians. For example, Spain viewed Indians as subjects of the crown. They sent missionaries to live among the Indians and civilize them and favored alliances with the tribal governments instead of trying to displace them. The English viewed tribes as sovereign trading partners. They also encouraged credit-based trade, which eventually led some tribes into debt. The United States viewed Indians as a barrier to expansion and settlement, which they were. In the early 1800s, the United States western border marked a line between the United States and the southeastern Indians. This mindset led to forced removal, which began in the early 1830s. When you review the history of Florida Indians, you discover the names of many different tribes over time. The Tamaqua are commonly cited during Florida's early history because of drawings created by the French artist Lemoyne in the mid-1500s. By the mid-1700s, groups forming the modern Seminole tribe were already in Florida. So were other tribes, such as Creek, Hitchity, Uchi, Alabama, and the others you see listed here. Next, we're going to talk about how 42 towns became lost to modern history. This story takes place over a very short period of time, just 60 years. The list in front of you is a list of treaties between the United States and the Creek Indian Confederacy. The first one is dated 1773, and the last one on the list is dated 1832, which resulted in removal. There are other treaties, but this is the time period for the story. There is one other thing to point out here. 60 years is an average lifespan for a person in the late 1700s. That means a person born in 1773 saw all of these events take place. There is another key point. A way of living that existed among the Indians for hundreds of years completely disappeared after 1832. One generation saw all of these changes and witnessed the disappearance of a way of living. The good news, I'm not going to talk about all of these treaties, only a few of them. We will start our story in 1801. This map shows the United States with its 1801 boundary in blue. It had recently obtained land from the Creeks and Cherokee, moving the border west to the Oconee River, which is in Georgia. The red dots with Creek town names shows the location of just a few of the better-known towns. There were a lot more. As a matter of fact, I use this map because it clearly shows the rivers. The Creek Indians made their towns beside running water, which is how they received their name. They lived along the creeks. Everywhere you see a river, there are Indian towns somewhere on it. This map shows the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw territories. As you look at this map, keep in mind each one of these groups had their own unique government. They were sovereign nations with their own laws and customs. People crossing borders, either from the United States into Creek or Cherokee territory, or Creeks into Choctaw or any of the other territories, had to follow the rules to cross the border. For the United States, that meant you had to obtain a passport issued by a state, such as Georgia, or the federal government. At least you were supposed to have one. There is one exception. Spain, the second time it possessed Florida, did not fully engage. It had a weak government with very little policing of its borders. Spain was not exerting pressure to expand or anything else. The Spanish missions had disappeared over 100 years earlier. I chose to show Spanish Florida as white on this map to represent how the Indians viewed Florida's northern border. It really wasn't there. People could freely pass in and out of Florida, and thousands did as they traveled to Pensacola to trade or travel down the river to reach the Gulf. Pensacola and St. Augustine were the two primary locations of Panton and Leslie Trading Company. They were incredibly active at this time. The Indian trade going to and from these two locations was huge. Our next big event happens in 1805 with the Treaty of Washington. The Creek Indian Confederacy cedes land to the United States. The United States gains the territory between the Oconee River and the Ocmulgee River and pushes its western border deeper into the Creek Confederacy. However, the Creeks retain rights for a little while longer to Oldfields, which is known today as the Ocmulgee Mounds National Park, located in Macon, Georgia. This location had been the capital of the Creek Confederacy. It was a major loss. The two teal dots on the left side of the map mark the location of two French forts. By 1805, Fort Toulouse had already ceased operating, and Fort Tom Beckby will cease to operate by 1810. The French are removing from the area and working to strengthen ties with the Choctaw and Chickasaw. They had operated trading posts at each of these forts, which, upon closing, forced more Indians to travel to Pensacola to trade with the British, who still operated Panton and Leslie. The major political players are now the Creek Confederacy, Choctaw, United States, and Panton and Leslie. Before we leave this map, there's one more thought. If today you were searching for records from this time period pertaining to the Creek Confederacy, where would you search? Who was creating paper records at this point in time? Who was writing things down? Primarily, it was the military. Those written by, or records written by Indian agents, Indian countrymen who lived among the Indians, and journals of travelers passing through, and Panton and Leslie. Just how many towns had to move to vacate the land between the Oconee and Ocmulgee rivers? I tried to find a map showing the towns between the Oconee and Ocmulgee rivers, but I couldn't find anything like that. But I did find this map, which I thought kind of conveyed similar information. It is specific to one language group under the Creek Confederacy umbrella, the Uchi Indians. It shows the movement of their towns over time. Of interest, it shows two Uchi groups had moved to Florida. One labeled St. John's River Uchi, and the other, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, who moved into North Florida in 1707. Another group, shown almost in the middle of the map, the Hogologies, are later found in North Florida. This map shows at least 7 Uchi towns east of the Ocmulgee River, and each one of them had to move somewhere else. We keep talking about moving towns like everybody just picked up their things and moved. What did it really involve? Did the Indians just fold up their teepees and move? What did moving a town really mean? Before we answer that, though, let's better define Creek Confederacy. It was an umbrella that encompassed communities speaking over 20 unique languages, such as Uchi, Hitchiti, and Alabama. Each of these communities had many towns scattered within the boundaries of the Confederacy, just like the previous map showed for the Uchis. Muskogee was the common language, much like English is today. Many Indians were bilingual, speaking their native tongue and Muskogee. So how big were these different towns, which were scattered along the rivers and the creeks? Most things that I've seen say the average size was between 200 and 300 residents, men, women, and children. Most military records only reported the number of warriors in a town, giving the impression the town was much smaller than it really was. Some towns were smaller than 200 and some were larger than 300. Some of the larger towns had smaller satellite towns, usually within 10 miles. The larger towns provided services to the satellite towns, more like an extended community. Residents of the satellite towns would come to the larger towns for ceremonies, governmental meetings, ball games, and other activities. What exactly did a town look like? I think everyone has an aha moment when they grasp what a Creek Indian town really looked like. This image, created by Richard Thornton, was mine. It was the cornfields. I had never envisioned the cornfields. And it got me to thinking, if you were going to grow enough corn for each person in the town to eat 1 ear of corn per day, that includes fresh corn and cornmeal, how many stalks of corn would you grow? Back then, each stalk produced a single ear of corn. That means you had to have 365 stalks of corn sitting out there in that cornfield for just one person. If each person needed 2 ears of corn and or corn products per day, you needed 730 stalks. For a town of 200 people, that translates to 146,000 stalks of corn to produce enough to feed everyone. It was also customary to grow 2 crops of corn, planted about 6 weeks apart, and harvested the same way. This picture also shows how a typical town was built along a bend in a river. What might stand out even more are the streets. Who knew creek towns had crisscrossing streets? This was really a surprise for me too. I never expected a creek town to look so much like a modern town. Towns had common or public spaces such as ceremonial grounds, a roundhouse or council house, a ball field, a centralized grain storage, and other public spaces. You can also see the little brown houses lining the street. Those green dots in the foreground is showing orchards. Yes, the Creek Indians planted trees in close proximity to their towns to make harvesting native fruits easier. Persimmons and plums were common fruits. Pecans are also native trees, easily grown for its nut. And wood. Keep in mind, many of these towns were established generations ago. They had existed on the same site for decades. Can you imagine all that would be involved to move this? Creek Indians did not live in teepees. A typical home consisted of 2 to 5 structures on a small plot within the town. The structures included a winter house, summer house, storage house, kitchen, and guest house. Housing styles, structures, and construction varied among the different language groups. There was a lot of diversity. This picture shows only one style. Another feature of a typical home was the personal garden. The woman of the house would grow specialty plants such as her favorite herbs, cultivars, or other family favorites. The cornfield was tended by members of the entire community. As you can guess, after seeing this, moving a town did not happen overnight. Some would move to the new location and begin preparations, while others remained behind to tend the crops. It may have taken 1 to 2 years for the entire town to move. The move would have been costly. They would have lost their orchards, cultivated grapevines, and other cultivated food sources the community had nurtured over the years. Continuing our story, the next major event occurs in 1811 when Tecumseh travels through the Creek Confederacy. He is trying to unite all the tribes, the Creeks, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and others. He wants them to join forces and fight the United States, who was so eager to gain more Indian lands. The pressure begins to build. One of the things Tecumseh does is pass out counting sticks, which he paints red, to all who say they will fight with him. This group becomes known as the Red Sticks. Now, counting sticks were commonly used. The way they worked is the person with the stick bundle would discard 1 stick each day. The number of sticks remaining in the bundle indicated how many days were left before they were to appear or meet up at the rendezvous place. The following year, the War of 1812 begins, placing the United States and Britain at war again. The British used their access to the Indians through the British Panton and Leslie Trading Company to try and turn the Indians against the United States. Trade restrictions and other sanctions also agitate the situation. The pressure builds. Some of the Creek Indians choose to fight beside the United States as friendly Indians. Before one war ends, another one starts. The Creek Indian Confederacy is split and the two sides start a civil war in 1813. The Upper Creeks are more isolated from the Europeans. They feel strongly that traditional ways should remain unchanged and they are against the United States and its expansion. On the other hand, the Lower Creeks have been more involved with Europeans. Some have moved away from traditional ways and they favored coexisting with Europeans. Many had adopted new technology, such as non-traditional houses with fireplaces. They also believed they could remain in their homeland. I want to take a minute and talk about this map showing all of the Upper and Lower Creek towns. It is a very common map shown in most history books about the Creek Wars. To orient you towards the bottom of the map, you will see the forks labeled where the two rivers come together. This is the junction of the Flint and Chattahoochee River, which is slightly above the Florida-Alabama state line. Notice this map only shows towns located along the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Chattahoochee rivers. Notice there are only 2 towns on the lower Chattahoochee River and none on the Flint River. If you count all of the towns shown on this map, there are 35 Upper Creek towns and 18 Lower Creek towns. I want you to remember those numbers. We're going to use them again. 35 Upper Creek, 18 Lower Creek. Now, who do you think is going to win this war? 35 towns to 18 towns. No story about the Creek Indians is complete without mentioning Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson and the Lower Creek leader, William McIntosh, joined forces and defeated the Upper Creeks at Horseshoe Bend in March 1814. This is the final battle of the Creek Indian Civil War. 5 months later, the Treaty of Fort Jackson is signed in August. The treaty is contested by many on both sides of the Creek Indian Civil War. Jackson becomes an American hero because he has defeated the Creek Indians. Let's talk a little more about the Treaty of Fort Jackson. First, I need to say I'm not exactly sure this map accurately shows the new land claimed by the United States. I think it shows too much land north of Florida, but matching landmarks found on other maps resulted in this map, so it's my best approximation. All right, the Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed in 1814, was very different from all other treaties. Andrew Jackson was the only United States representative, and he dictated the terms of the treaty. All other treaties offered both parties a win and a loss. You give me this, I'll give you that. There was some form of give and trade. But this treaty didn't work that way. The Creek Confederacy gave everything. They agreed to reimburse the United States their cost in fighting the Upper Creeks, cease all communications with Spain and Britain, surrender the Upper Creek leaders, allow the United States to cut roads through their territory. The land the Creek Confederacy ceded to the United States was north of the Florida state line, and it cut them off from their primary trading partner, Panton and Leslie. It also eliminated their access to the Gulf. Creek Indians who previously relocated to Spanish West Florida were now required to cross into and through the United States when visiting towns further north. Towns along the lower Chattahoochee and Flint rivers, which is north of the Florida state line, were also expected to move. Many chose to move south into Spanish West Florida. As shown on this map, the Cherokee and Choctaw have also ceded more land to the United States. The United States is rapidly expanding. 2 years later, in 1816, Andrew Jackson leads his forces into Spanish West Florida. This war is called the First Seminole War. Battles are fought in North Florida along the Apalachicola River and north of the Florida state line along the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers. Other battles are fought near Bainbridge, Tallahassee, Fort St. Marks, and the Suwannee River. Andrew Jackson captures Pensacola in 1818. During these 3 years, Jackson sends Captain Young into Florida to locate all Indian towns and provide counts on their populations. His report is deemed classified, a secret military report, and never shared with Congress or the public. Now, why do you think Jackson called the Creek Indians living in North Florida Seminoles? Because he had already defeated the Creek Indians and become a national hero. He had no reason to fight more Creek Indians. He had already defeated them. He also needed a new enemy in order to invade Spanish West Florida. So he declared all Indians in Florida Seminoles and waged a war against them to reach Pensacola. About the time the First Seminole War is ending, the Creek Indians further north signed the Treaty of Creek Agency. They exchanged 2 small tracts of land for $120,000 paid over 11 years. They needed money to pay back the United States for the cost of the Creek Civil War. This treaty also required the United States to remove people trying to settle within their boundaries and to provide blacksmith services. In 1818, Florida is still a Spanish territory. There are no United States settlements in North Florida, excluding the city of Pensacola. North Florida is populated by Creek Indians and a small handful of Spaniards. The very next year, 1819, Spain gives Florida to the United States and everything changes. The treaty is not ratified until 1821, which is the official date Florida became a U.S. territory. The first American settlers, however, began arriving in 1819. Andrew Jackson becomes Florida's territorial governor. Think about that for a minute. All of those Indians who fled into Spanish Florida to get away from the American politics are suddenly right back in the middle of it. Andrew Jackson enacts harsh laws that prohibit Florida residents from trading with the Indians. By 1827, anyone caught buying, selling, or trading with Indians would be fined $500, whipped 32 lashes on a bare back, and or jailed. Now, $500 in 1827 is equivalent to $16,000 today. That gives you a better idea of how strong this fine was. Some North Florida Indians moved a few miles north into Alabama and Georgia to avoid these harsh laws. Andrew Jackson appoints a Frenchman, Jean-Augustin Pinard, as Florida's first Indian agent. Pinard does not speak English, does not speak any of the Indian languages, and his first official report sent to Congress in 1821 is wrong. On it, he identifies 100 to 150 Indians on the Georgia border and mentions McIntosh by name. Now, McIntosh lived near present-day Columbus, Georgia, which is nowhere near Florida. Furthermore, McIntosh signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson a few years ago and was well known by Governor Andrew Jackson and Congress. In Pinard's report, he identifies 6 types of Creek Indians and 7 types of Seminoles as residents of Florida. He estimates the Indian population in Florida to be no more than 5,000, men, women, and children. He also identifies 500 to 600 escaped slaves. And he goes on to say, Florida has never been well peopled. This is Florida's first official report on its Indians. Let that sink in. Captain John R. Bell becomes Florida's second Indian agent. As acting agent in 1822, he reports 8 towns in East Florida as Seminoles. 27 towns, he implies, are not Seminoles. He says the chief of the Seminoles lives 100 miles south of the Alachua Plains, which is south of Gainesville, Florida. Once again, we hear the same totals: 5,000 men, women, and children. That's the total number of Indians in the entire state of Florida. But the number of slaves has decreased. Instead of the previously reported 500 to 600 slaves, Bell reports only 300 runaway slaves. Bell also gives the locations within Florida for each town. In North Florida, he said Indian towns are on Lake Miccosukee and on the St. Marks, Ochlockonee, Apalachicola, and Chattahoochee rivers, and some towns exist west of the Suwannee River. That means they exist somewhere between St. Marks and the Suwannee River. Bell's report is given to Thomas Metcalf, who shares a summary of the report with Congress. In Metcalf's summary, he adds, the Indians are few in numbers, dispersed over an immense region of country. Now, to me, the underlying message in Florida's early Indian reports translate to, Florida doesn't really have an Indian problem. Come on down, you settlers. You have nothing to fear down here. I also get the feeling Florida's early government didn't want to really know how many Indians were living within its borders. Another list of Florida's Indian towns is compiled in 1823 by Neamathla. He identifies 37 towns and chiefs. That's 2 more towns than what Captain Bell reported. He places 26 towns in North Florida, that's west of the Suwannee River, and 11 towns in East Florida. The North Florida towns are located on Lake Miccosukee and on the St. Marks, Ochlockonee, Apalachicola, and Chattahoochee rivers, the same location list we've seen before. He also adds 2 towns on the Osceola River. The math works, right? They just found a new pocket of Indians on the Osceola River. But when you dive deep into this list and begin comparing actual town names, it becomes obvious the names of previously mentioned towns are omitted and new towns have been added. Counting Indians in Florida is still fuzzy math. That same year, in 1823, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which is between the United States and the Florida Indians, is signed. Jackson attempts to round up all of the Florida Indians and place them on a reservation in Central Florida. The North Florida Indians, especially those who fought beside Andrew Jackson, refuse. They request and are granted 4 small reservations in North Florida. Now I need to take a minute and tell you that the size of these reservations shown on this map are probably a little larger than they actually were. The reservations were actually only 2 miles in size. The shape and location is correct. 3 of these reservations are along the Chattahoochee and Apalachicola rivers. The area reserved for Neamathla is shown as a dot near present-day Quincy, Florida. Neamathla never moved his town to this location. It was reserved but never occupied. There is still some fuzzy math going on. What happened to the Indians living on Lake Miccosukee and the ones on the Ochlockonee, St. Marks, and Osceola rivers? Why weren't they given reservations? Were they forced to move? Just to add a little clarity, the First Seminole War, which we have already discussed, was led by Andrew Jackson and fought in North Florida and South Georgia. The focus was removing the Creek Indians' access to British trade in Pensacola. The Second Seminole War was fought between 1835 and 1842. This is the war with Osceola, and it was fought in Central and South Florida. It's also the war most people think of when they hear Seminole War. The Third Seminole War was fought between 1855 and 1858 in South Florida. So, a little recap. Andrew Jackson conquered the Creek Indians in 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, fought the Seminoles in 1818 and captured Pensacola, became Florida's first territorial governor in 1821, and then he becomes President of the United States in 1829. The following year, 1830, he passes the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act authorized the voluntary exchange of Indian lands in the Southeast for federal land west of the Mississippi. It also established an area west of the Mississippi for Indian Territory. Today, this area is mostly within the boundaries of Oklahoma. Basically, it made removal the primary goal and set the stage leading to the Trail of Tears. It also empowered officials by granting them legal authority to pressure, bribe, or threaten Indians into signing removal treaties. Just 2 years later, in 1832, the Creek Indians in Alabama and Georgia signed one treaty, while those in Florida signed another. The Alabama and Georgia Creek Indians lose all of their land when they sign the Treaty of Cusata. Each person is given the option of removing or remaining. However, if they remain, they must give up their traditional lifestyle. Those who choose to stay are granted a U.S. land patent for approximately 300 acres of land. Very few were successful, and most sold their land and moved west. Florida Indians signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing. Basically, they agreed to look at the land west of the Mississippi. They did not agree to move. Edward Parson and Benjamin Abbott were sent to conduct a census of all the Alabama and Georgia Creek Indians. They needed to determine exactly how many were moving and who was choosing to stay. Parson and Abbott traveled to each Indian town and write down the name of the male head of household and a count of the number of people living in that home. They do not write down every Indian's name, only the head of the household. They also provide a list of those who they say want to remain in the East. They enumerate 82 towns, 6,279 households, totaling 22,240 Creek Indians. Do you remember the total number of towns involved in the 1813 Creek Indian Civil War? It was 35 upper towns and 18 lower towns for a total of 53 towns. Now they have identified 82 towns, and they only traveled the Chattahoochee, Flint, Alabama, P, Tombigbee, Coosa, and Tallapoosa rivers. What do you think? Did they find all the towns? Most history books say Indian towns were fleeing Alabama and Georgia into Florida during and after the Creek Civil War. So if that was true, why did they find more towns in Alabama and Georgia? They should have found less, right? Another key point is Parson and Abbott did not enter Florida. Their survey stopped north of the Florida-Alabama state line. Basically, it stopped at the bottom of Creek territory. They did not enter what had become Alabama's territory along the Alabama-Florida state line. The very next year, 1833, the reservation Indians in North Florida along the Chattahoochee and Apalachicola rivers were enumerated on a census now called the Apalachicola Indian Census. These were the Indians placed on reservations by the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. The census identified the 5 towns listed. On this census, each family is asked if they will remove or stay. Some say stay. These 5 towns were very visible to the early settlers because they lived along a major water highway. Florida had only a few roads in the 1830s, which means traveling relied heavily on water routes. These Indians were well known in the area and probably feared by newly arriving settlers. They were forced to remove between 1836 and 1840. They relocated to Texas, not Oklahoma. So why is so much of this story not common knowledge? What happened? In 1922, John Reed Swanton published a book, Early History of the Creek Indians and Their Neighbors. He was an American anthropologist and linguist who worked with the southeastern Indians. He was actually hired by the United States to conduct research, and he was granted access to all available documents the United States had accumulated, which included eyewitness accounts, some military documents, reports from Indian agents, all of it. His book compiled, organized, and quoted these original documents. He took a huge mountain of paper and made sense of it, categorizing the various towns into tribes and, more importantly, language groups. He worked on this project for more than 40 years. He also visited the Indians and asked questions, seeking the truth instead of speculating. He identifies all Indians in Florida as Seminoles, based on the records he finds. His book becomes the primary source for all things Creek Indian. Future researchers use his book instead of digging through stacks of dusty papers. He has organized everything, and it is just easier to use his book. His conclusions become gospel and are repeated in every history book. 10 years after his book is released, those detailed reports made by Captain Young and other military agents, which were kept secret by Andrew Jackson, are declassified. For the first time, researchers have access to the information shared in this presentation about the Creek Indian towns in North Florida. But the horse has already left the barn. The political rhetoric of the early 1820s has been sanctioned and repeated in Swanton's book, and so the myth lives on. Only Seminoles lived in Florida. When you do review those declassified records and try to sort through all the spelling variations for each town name, because each time it was written down, it was spelled the way the writer heard it. Sometimes they heard all of the syllables and sometimes they did not. This is the list. It is the best guessed list of towns identified in North Florida. That's from the Swanee River west. These are shown by geographic area, starting in Florida's far west, which is Pensacola, and moving eastward. There are 47 towns in total, of which 5 were enumerated in the Apalachicola Indian Census. That leaves 42 towns whose residents are unknown. In conclusion, I want to say one more thing. So many of us with family histories leading back to the Creek Indians in the Florida Panhandle cannot prove our Indian heritage. I believe we descend from individuals living in these historic Creek Indian towns. In my own family, 3 of my grandparents have 1 or more branches in their tree that dead ends with Creek Indian unproven. This has been and will always be a problem for those of us who descend from these towns. We cannot trace our ancestors back to paper records because paper records were never created. Instead, our ancestors were swept under the carpet and their existence was hidden for 100 years. In closing, I'd like to say thank you for watching this presentation. For those of you who are researching your Creek Indian ancestry in the North Florida area, I hope this presentation has provided insight and suggestions on where to look to learn more. Thank you.